Our first speaker is John Shoraka. Many of you know John. He is the founder of Gov Contract Pros, and in the handout you have his full bio here. So go ahead and welcome John, please, to the stage.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Yvette. Thank you to the National Center for having me. Thank you for the sponsors. And thank you for the folks that are online. I know since we've come out from COVID, some people are comfortable traveling, some others are not, and that's all great. So we appreciate the participation online. Lastly, we're a small, one quick question for Yvette. Where'd she go? Do we have questions online? Can they ask questions online? Okay, so in the audience, they go to the mic in the middle, but if they have a question online, are they able to do anything, or is that? Oh, okay. It's answered, yeah? Okay, so if you have questions online, we can answer those as well. So, thank you guys for being here. My session covers federal contracting and the benefits for the Native community in general and individual Native-owned firms and socially and economically disadvantaged firms, right? So if you think about the federal government is the largest buyer of goods and services in the whole world, and participating in that marketplace with the federal government as your client can be a great source of revenue, and diversifying to include the federal marketplace in your portfolio is really important, at least from my perspective. My background is I used to run the federal government set-aside programs for a period of 7 years. We'll talk about the various set-aside programs. The federal government, by law, has to set aside contracts for small businesses, 8A companies, socially and economically disadvantaged companies, which includes Native-owned companies, women-owned companies, service-disabled companies, and historically underutilized business zone companies. And I'll explain all that. I think I have a clicker here. I have a the slide is relatively long, right? But what I'd like to try to do is keep this interactive. We're a small group, so I think we can have Q&A and keep the discussion going. I know that if you listen to me just speaking to you for 2 hours, you're probably going to get really bored and then be really ready for lunch and maybe not the afternoon. But if we keep the discussion going, I think we can have a good interactive discussion on what's really important to you guys. And that's why I wanted to make sure that the folks online had an ability to ask questions as well. So generally speaking, what I'd like to try to do is just talk about the federal marketplace in general to lay the groundwork, right? Talk about the set-aside programs, or what are the different ways the federal government buys, what are the goals that they have, and then how do they buy, as well as how do we get approved for the various programs, like 8A, HUBZone, women-owned, service-disabled. So real quick, how many small business owners do we have in the audience? Awesome, okay. And of those, how many are currently federal contractors? Okay, good. How many are eligible or think they're eligible for one of the socio categories? Let's say 8A. Women-owned, service-disabled, and then HUBZone. Okay. Okay, so we'll talk about all that. This is great because that gives me a general idea of sort of where to focus on. Oftentimes there are folks that have significant experience, so they want to talk a little bit about more like the mentor-protege program, which we'll try to get to. But then there's the basics of just working with the federal government that can be sometimes daunting. But the one thing that I'll say is it can seem like a maze, but if you just are persistent and use the resources that are available out there, and a lot of these resources are free, right? So Chris is here from, used to be the PTAC. It's the Apex Center now, right? Apex Incubator? Accelerator. And she'll be speaking this afternoon. And she's connected with the National Center. But there are resources in your communities as well. There's small business development centers. There's the SBA district offices. There are small women's business centers. So I would encourage you to try and figure that out. When I was at the SBA, I originally started out as a regional administrator. That meant I had 7 district offices from Pennsylvania down to Richmond. In some districts, the SBDC was really strong. In other districts, it was the PTAC, or the Women's Business Center. So if you walk in the door at one of the service providers, don't be dissuaded if it doesn't match what you're looking to do. I'd go to the other ones to find a good match. You will find a good match. So the federal marketplace in general, and by the way, I know Yvette said come up to ask questions. That's a little too formal. If you guys want to just raise your hand and shoot out a question, that works too, right? And I'll repeat it for the folks online. I know she wanted the folks online to be able to hear, but feel free just to raise your hand and ask a question. So the federal government is the largest buyer of goods and services in the entire world, and they buy everything, right? So if you think about anything that the federal government, the Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, Department of Homeland Security, every single agency buys everything from, bolts, nuts, equipment, building, janitorial services, procurement services, financial services, consulting services, professional services. So it's sort of the whole gambit, right? And it's roughly $120 to $150 billion have to go to small businesses each year, right? So the federal government roughly spends, and the number's not up there, but it's in excess of $700 billion, right? And 23% of that, by statute, has to go to small business. So it's every year there's opportunities for small businesses. Now, if you look under that, there's what we used to call the 5533. So 5% for small disadvantaged or 8A companies, 5% for women-owned small businesses, 3% for service disabled, and 3% for HUBZone. The federal government has always met the 5% goal for small disadvantaged, and the Biden administration, when they came in, they said, wow, look, we usually hit 10% on SDB and 8A. Let's make sure we cast a broader net and increase the goal. So by executive order, that first goal was increased to 15%. Now, from 5 to 15 sounds like a huge increase, right? But the federal government had been hitting 10, 10.5, almost 11. So the first year, which was I think last year, they said we're going to hit 11. That was easy. This year it's going to jump up to 12. It's going to keep going up until it gets to 15. So as it goes up year after year, it's going to be harder and harder to meet that requirement, right? So the federal government, and I know we'll have some folks from MBDA, I don't think the district office is here, but the federal government has an initiative to cast a broader net, to bring in more small and disadvantaged businesses into their portfolio in order to meet that goal, right? So if you think you can qualify as an 8A company, I'd encourage you to look at that and see, okay, well, what are the steps to get qualified? And then how do I participate in the federal marketplace? And those are some of the things we're going to talk about. Federal government has met the 5% goal before. The numbers just came out yesterday, actually, for 2022, and they missed the 5% goal. So that's a challenge for the federal government. So if you think you can qualify for the Women-Owned Small Business Program, I'd encourage you to look at that as well. Service disabled, they've met that every year, and they should. And then with the HUBZone program, the HUBZone program is historically underutilized business zones. And they've never met that goal, right? And the goal is only 3%. Now, what is a historically underutilized business zone? Historically underutilized business zone are areas identified by Housing and Urban Development, the agency, that have high economic unemployment, high high poverty rates. There's a whole formula that establishes historically underutilized business zone. The SBA, if you go to the SBA and do search for hub zone, they have a map. And you can put in your address, really simple. They've updated the map. It's pretty simple to use. You put in your address and it'll tell you, am I in a hub zone? Now, it's interesting, and we'll talk about the hub zone requirements, but your headquarters don't have to be in a hub zone. Your principal office has to be in a hub zone. And a principal office, all that means is where most employees work. So if you have 2 offices and you have 3 employees in one location and 2 employees in the other, the one with the 3 employees is your principal office. So we have clients that, it's not really gaming the system, it's really following the system. We have clients that'll move an employee from here to here to make sure that this is their principal office and this is in a hub zone, right? And then when you look at that principal office requirement, you can exclude your project site employees. So if you have someone working at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base or on-site at, IBM or Northrop, you can exclude those guys from your calculation. So you exclude your project site employees. You look at everybody else, see where most of the people are, that's your principal office. So that's requirement number 1, is my principal office in a hub zone? Requirement number 2 is, do 35% of my employees live in a hub zone, right? And that doesn't mean the same hub zone. It means any hub zone, okay? And an employee is anybody that works 40 hours a month, right? So it encourages getting interns. A lot of times interns are in college towns. You could hire an intern in a college town. It doesn't have to be in your town. They can work remotely. And as long as they work 40 hours a month, they count as an employee for hub zone purposes. So those are the 2 requirements. And the reason I wanted to sort of go into that is because the federal government has historically never met the hub zone goal. So if you can qualify as a hub zone firm, I'd encourage you to, because that's one of the areas they want to identify more firms to help meet the goal. Now, the other thing that a lot of folks don't realize is that the federal government gets double, triple, quadruple credit, right? So if you're small, 8A, hub zone, woman-owned, service-disabled, which I call the unicorn, then the federal, so they give you $1 million contract. They get $1 million in each of those buckets. So the federal government can't do a multiple set-aside. So then when they go to set aside a contract, and we'll talk about how that works, when they go to set aside a contract, they have to pick, hey, is this going to be an 8A contract? Or is this going to be set aside for women-owned small businesses? That's fine, but you still look more attractive to the contracting officer because they can check off multiple socioeconomic categories when you're awarded that contract. And then the other thing is, if it's even awarded, even if it's not set aside, right? Even if it's issued as a full and open requirement, if you win, the federal government still gets to get credit. So it's just, if you think you can qualify for those, I would encourage you to look at it and identify ways of qualifying, because it just makes you more attractive with respect to the federal government and the federal government getting to their goals. We can talk about this later if we have time. The federal, yes, ma'am. No, I can hear you.
You said set aside. Does that include sole source?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was set asides versus sole source. And by the way, these slides are all available, and I'm not going to follow the slides, so we'll jump around. Set aside versus sole source. So when the federal government looks at a requirement, if there are 2 or more small businesses that can provide the product or service, they have to set it aside for small business. Now, the federal government can decide, or the contracting officer has the discretion to decide if they're going to do 8A, hub zone, women-owned, service-disabled, depending on where they are with their goals. If they're already meeting the 8A goal, they can set it aside for the women-owned small business. So that's the set-aside component. In the 8A program, there are streamlined authorities to direct award or sole source a contract. So in the 8A program, and the 8A program is very unique in that sense. In the 8A program, a contracting officer can direct award a contract up to the threshold, which is $4.5 million for individually owned firms, without competition, without justification, and without approval, right? So it's entirely at the discretion of the contracting officer. Now, they do a government cost estimate, you have to develop a proposal, you have to negotiate it, but it's a direct award. And that authority to direct award exists that way, in a streamlined fashion, exists only in the 8A program. So that's a really good question, because if you think you qualify for the 8A program, I would encourage you to look at it, because it's the only program with that type of authority. Now, the challenge with the 8A program is twofold. It's a 9-year program, right? That's why you have this special authority. It's a 9-year program. You wouldn't want to get into the 8A program unless you're ready to be in the program, right? Because you don't want that 9-year clock to start ticking and you wasting your first 2, 3, 4 years trying to gain traction, because there's a developmental phase in the 8A program through year 6, and then there's a transitionary phase, 7, 8, and 9, where they wean you off of that sole source that you asked about, right? So in year 7, I think it goes down to like 70% of your contracts can be sole source, and it goes down from there. So if you don't take the most opportunity in the first 5 years with respect to sole source, you're not going to be able to do it in the latter years. So a lot of times when we talk about this, and I know Chris talks to her clients about this, don't get into the 8A program, because the SBA has to let you in if you qualify, right? And we'll talk about the qualifications real quick. But don't get into the 8A program if you don't already have some track record of performance with the federal government. If you already don't have a network that you can leverage with the federal government. So do you have, are you on or present at a buying activity? Does the program officer, the contracting officer, know who you are and the fact that you do good work? Because those are the times where you can say, hey, guess what? I've been here. I've been doing good work. Now I'm 8A certified, and you can direct award to me. The opposite, if you just get your 8A without any of those networks or connections, a lot of folks are like, well, I got my 8A, I'll just get contracts. That doesn't happen, right? You have to have the relationships, the networks, et cetera, to leverage that 8A sole source authority. The other programs, the women-owned, service-disabled, and Hub Zone, they also have a sole source authority, but it's much more stringent. Congress will argue that it's more stringent because you can be a women-owned small business indefinitely, or service-disabled, or Hub Zone, because as long as you remain small and meet the program requirements, you can stay in those programs. So the way it's restricted is that the contracting officer has to demonstrate that you are the only firm that can provide that product or service. So the contracting officer, being risk averse, oftentimes doesn't want to write a justification and have it approved from a higher authority that says you're the only firm that can provide this product or service. Now, when I was running these programs, we would argue with buying agencies and say, hey, you know what? You can be creative. You can say this is the only women-owned small business in this jurisdiction or this geographical area that can provide this product or service. Or this is the only Hub Zone company with this type of past performance that can provide this product or service. However, contracting officers are often risk averse. So if you look at the numbers, you'll quickly realize that when you talk about sole source, almost 90% of all sole sources occur in the 8A world, not in the others. How many tribally owned entities do we have, or folks from tribes? Okay. So there's a little bit of a difference when it comes to tribally owned entities, right? In the 8A program, the program is really an economic development tool for the tribe, right? And a lot of folks, when I was running these programs, a lot of folks would come to me and say, well, wait a second. how come tribes have unlimited sole source? So we talked about sole source for individual companies, right? 4.5 million. Tribes have unlimited sole source. They have a cap, $100 million. That's where the contracting officer has to write a justification and approval. That's at DOD. At other agencies, it's 22. It might have gone up to 25. So a tribe, because they support an entire community, as Derek was saying earlier, these are economic development tools. Because the tribe supports an entire community, they have much higher sole source authorities, right? And at civilian agencies at 22, I think it's 22 and a half, it might have gone up. After you get to that threshold, the contracting officer then has to write the justification and approval. And at the Department of Defense, it's 100 million. So what we see is a lot of times you won't see sole source to tribes above those thresholds. Again, contracting officers are risk averse. They're willing to go up to that threshold. It's easy. Beyond that, it's much more difficult. You have to get approval, et cetera. The other thing that I'll just point out, since we have tribal organizations here, I really encourage in this environment to look at the 8A program, because it honestly, and this isn't to the disadvantage of individual firms, although contracting officers will tend to do the easy thing as with agencies, because if you have to get to 15% 8A, the easy button is a $100 million sole source, right? You get there a lot quicker. I mean, it's just simple math, right? So if you are a tribe, if you're not in the 8A program, I definitely look at participating, leveraging the 8A program for economic development growth. Now look, the SBA wants to make sure the benefits are flowing to the intended recipients. Are they? There's tribal organizations that can participate in the 8A program. There's Alaskan Native corporations that can participate in the 8A program, and there's Native Hawaiian organizations that can participate in the 8A program. Alaskan Natives and tribes can get the unlimited sole source everywhere, civilian and DOD. Native Hawaiian organizations are limited to the Department of Defense. For whatever reason, the statute was written that way. They're trying to change that, but right now they're limited to the Department of Defense. The other thing that I should mention with tribes is tribes don't just have one bite at the apple, right? As an individual, remember we talked about the 9 years. We said make sure you take advantage of all of those 9 years. And you get assigned a business opportunity specialist at the SBA, and we can talk about that and how often are, how effective they are, how good they are. It's mixed. Some of them are awesome. Some of them are overworked, and they just don't have the resources to be able to support the 8A companies. So there's individual 8As can have one 8A, one bite at the apple. Tribes, you can have multiple 8As, right? You can have 8A number 1. You can either wait till that 8A number 1 is graduated and start 8A number 2, or you can just start 8A number 2. Oftentimes tribes will start their first 8A as a general 8A. It'll sort of be a catch-all, whatever kind of business, construction, IT services, IT hardware, maintenance and operation, we'll do all of that if we can generate the work. Once we start building that first 8A, then we start taking out, okay, IT services, that'll be 8A number 2. Construction, that'll be 8A number 3. Professional services, that'll be 8A number 4. There is one restriction. And we'll talk about North American Industry Classification Codes, NAICS codes, industry codes. You can't have 2 8As in the same industry code as a tribe. And you have to be out of that industry for 2 years before you pop in a new one under that same NAICS code. Now, NAICS codes are 5-digit codes. You can just change the last digit by 1. It's pretty similar. You can pop in a second. So there's a whole strategy. If you go to like a really large Alaskan Native corporation, they'll have a board this size with like a whole strategy on their 8As and when are they going to graduate, what contracts do we have, when are we going to pop in the next 8A, how do we transition those contracts over, et cetera. So there's a whole strategy around that. But the reason tribes, Alaskan Native corporations, and Native Hawaiian organizations have that advantage, right? Unlimited sole source, multiple 8As, is because they support entire communities, as opposed to the 8A, which supports, the individual that the designation is based upon. Does that all make sense? Any questions so far? No? Any questions online? No? Okay. So a lot of times hub zones are overlaid with enterprise zones, right? But they don't specifically have a designation for federal contracting. If you look at the maps, a lot of times they'll overlay, but those enterprise zones by themselves don't have a special privilege with respect to federal contracting. Yep. So for the basics of, and Chris will go over this, but I just want to sort of brush on this and then talk about when we say, are you ready, right? What do I mean by that? First of all, know the basic systems, right? If you want to do work with the federal government, even if you've been doing work for a while, sometimes even if you're a subcontractor, how many subcontractors do we have? Is anybody a sub to a larger prime? Okay. And by the way, I'm sorry, that's a good point. Let me go back. So this 5533, prime contractors, large prime contractors have the same goal, right? So if you are starting off and you're finding it difficult to get a foothold in the federal government as a prime, because sometimes it can be difficult, you can be a subcontractor to a large prime. So if you look at Northrop Grumman, if you look at AECOM, Boeing, even medium-sized firms, if they're other than small, they have the 5533 goals as well. So they're trying to identify small, women-owned, disadvantaged companies to help meet that goal. So that's another way to look to enter the federal marketplace. So if you're wanting to do work with the federal government, you have to be in SAM, right? So you have to register in SAM. And again, there are resources to help you do that. You can do it online. As soon as you start the process, you're going to get like 100 emails from random people saying they'll help you and they'll charge you $250 or $500. You can do it yourself, or you can have a resource partner help you, right? You can go out and hire someone to do it. There's nothing wrong with that. But know that you don't have to hire someone to do it. And be persistent, right? For whatever reason, it is not the most, and by the way, I come from government. Well, I come from private sector. My dad started a government contracting operation back in the 80s. I did that. Then I went to government. Now I do advisory work. So if I tease or make fun of the government, I do that in a loving way because I've been in government. But it's a government process, right? SAM is a government process. It sometimes doesn't make sense because you start at GSA, you start in SAM, you have to coordinate it with IRS and your EIN. Yes, ma'am. Yes, so don't worry about taking pictures or writing notes. The slides can go out to everybody and people online too, so don't worry about taking notes. And if you have questions following this, feel free. My email's on the slides. National Center knows how to get in touch with me. I'm always happy to follow up with any answers on anything we've discussed or things we haven't discussed. So the SAM process starts at GSA. It coordinates with IRS. And SAM was recently updated. And if your address doesn't exactly match, and I mean exactly, like if the suite number is on the second line instead of the first line, it'll bounce back. And then it has to go to Defense Logistic Agency. Don't ask me why they were originally, and Chris may know this, but don't ask me why they're responsible for assigning cage codes. I don't know why it goes there, but it has to go there. They were first. And so there's all these different things that happen, and you have to follow it and respond in time. Because you'll get an email and they'll say, hey, we just want to verify. And sometimes it'll end up in your junk box. And they give you 3 days. And if you don't respond, you have to start all over again. So it's easy to get frustrated and give up. Don't just be persistent. You'll get it. And if you can't, use the resources that are available for you. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say, I read
Awesome, awesome. Okay, did everybody hear that? The GSA, I think it's GSA that did that actually, has a YouTube video on SAM, and it's helpful. So number one is getting into SAM, right? Then all the requirements that come out, let's say you want to bid on something, are in SAM. And you can set up a SAM search. You can do it by NAICS code, North American Industry Classification Code. You can do it by product service code. You can do it by keyword search. But this is what I'll say. If you're looking at SAM for requirements to bid on, you're probably behind the curve, right? Because the folks that are going to be your competitors, they're probably already at the agency. They've probably already teamed up with somebody. They're probably already prepared most of their proposal. So being aware of what's out on SAM is important, but getting ahead of that is important as well. So what do I mean by that? I mean, the federal government is so large, you could do a shotgun approach, and you might get lucky, but being targeted is really important. So if you look at usaspending.gov, you can go in there, and you can do, and USA Spending is every contract the federal government has ever let in excess of $25,000. So you could go in there and do a search for industry, product service code, keywords, and the trick is who's buying what I'm selling, right? Widgets, who's buying the most widgets? You don't want necessarily to identify, you know, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is buying widgets, but there's one $1 billion contract. Well, that's probably not good for us, right? So if you find the highest buyers, then you want to drill down to, is there a plurality? And then you want to drill down, are they setting it aside? Are they setting it aside for 8A, women-owned, service disabled? Are they friendly with the type of business that I am, right? And then you want to decide or identify, are they buying it off of individual contracts, like one-off contracts, or are there government-wide acquisition contracts that they're using, or the federal supply schedule that they're using to do the acquisition, right? So this all gets pretty complicated. But I'd say it takes some time to sort of understand all this, but don't give up because it seems complicated. The federal government can buy through individual contracts, one-off contracts, right? And they're listed in SAM. They can buy from government-wide acquisition contracts. So let's say government was buying widgets, and they've done this more and more recently, and they call it category management. Let's say government's buying widgets. Instead of having thousands and thousands and thousands of contracts buying widgets, they've decided, hey, we'll have one master contract for widgets. If the federal government wants to buy widgets, they're going to go to this master contract. We're going to have contract holders, so we'll have 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 contract holders, but we're going to make all the agencies go to this one master contract to buy widgets. Now, there's a couple of challenges there. When I was running the programs, we argued that this wasn't friendly to small business. GSA and OMB, Office of GSA General Services Administration and Office of Management and Budget argued that, hey, wait a second, we're still going to meet our small business goals. Why? Because of the 25, 30, 40, 50 businesses that won that master contract, maybe half of them were small. So they could still meet their 25-3-3, but now they're meeting them with fewer and fewer companies, right? Because what happened to all those thousands of widget sellers? So there'd been an initiative to establish these government-wide contracts, what we call category management. And every year the goal was to bring more dollars under management. So you have to be aware when you look at how the government is buying, you have to be aware, are they generally going to these schedules or these government-wide acquisition vehicles, or are they doing the one-off contracts that I can play with in that marketplace, right? And if they're going to those larger government-wide acquisition vehicles, that doesn't mean, oh, okay, no go, right? It means let's do some more homework. Like, who has those government-wide acquisition contracts? Do they have subcontracting goals, right? Are they doing matchmaking? How do I get in their supply chain? So it's just figuring out how government is buying, and then figuring out how you fit into that puzzle. So that's USA Spend. Now, a lot of folks, when they go through SAM, and it sounds like you did, don't realize, and sometimes this link is broken. How many people have gone through SAM? Okay. How many people know what DSBS is, Dynamic Small Business Search? Okay. So a lot of people don't realize that when you go through SAM, it asks you all these questions, right? And then it asks you revenue or number of employees, or both. And depending what NAICS code, North American Industry Classification Code you're in, and please call me out if I'm using an acronym that you don't know. Government loves that. Depending on what NAICS code you're in, manufacturing is employee-based, everything else, almost everything else, is revenue-based. It determines if you're small. If you're small, you don't know this, but it opens an additional folder for you. You answer questions, but that's Dynamic Small Business Search. A lot of folks will go into SAM, fill it out, get to the end, and be like, I don't have to fill this other stuff out. DSBS allows you to upload your quals, past performance, information on your firm, right? Why is that important? Because a contracting officer, when they're looking for small businesses, one of their research tools is Dynamic Small Business Search. They have access, like you can go to Dynamic Small Business Search, you can go to dsbs.gov, I think that's what it is. By the way, if you ever go to any of these and they want to charge you, you're at the wrong place. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't some good tools, like third-party tools like FedMine or Bloomberg Government or BidSpeed or others that are good tools that take all this data and make it more user-friendly. But you don't have to pay for this stuff, right? So if you go to dsbs.gov, you can do a search for 8A companies in your, by geography, by NAICS code, by PSC. But contracting officers have a unique portal into DSBS. And that's one of the ways they do market research. So if you're not updating DSBS, if you're not inputting your past performance and your experience, they're not able to see you. And that's important, and we'll talk about that in a second. Is it here? Yeah. We'll talk about that in a second. So it's important. And then the last thing I'd say is, on DSBS, it's kind of an antiquated system. When the contracting officer goes to search, the firm that updated it last ends up on the search list first. So we have clients that'll go in there and put in a period, put in a sentence, take out a sentence, so update it regularly, at least once a quarter. And then the last thing is, when we talked about the prime contractors having to meet their subcontracting goals, the SBA has a system that's called Subnet. I'm not that happy with it. It's not updated quite as much as one would expect it to be, but large firms that aren't meeting their goals have an opportunity to advertise on Subnet, and sometimes you may be able to find an opportunity that matches what you're selling with a large prime contractor. Now, one thing that I'll say before I move on, and then I want to see if there's any questions. So once you identify your top 5, let's say, or top 10, because you really want a really targeted approach, right? You don't want to do a shotgun approach, because that's where most firms get frustrated, right? Firms entering the federal market, because it's a huge maze, they do the shotgun approach and they're like, this never works. Everybody else wins, I don't win, I can't develop the relationships, this isn't working for me. You have to have a very strategic approach. So once you do your analysis, it's like, what's your top 5 or top 10? First thing folks do is, I'm gonna go to the contracting officer, right? And that's okay. Contracting officers execute on the acquisition, right? They look at following the rules. They look at making sure it's set aside if it's supposed to be set aside. But it's not really their money. They're just executing on a requirement. There's the contracting office and there's a program office. The program office has the funds. So you want to identify the contracting shop, and the program shop. And you want to figure out, how do I get in front of both? And then sort of the third leg to the stool is, every agency has a small business office. So for those guys who've actually registered in SAM, or just for anybody, how many folks know what a OSDBU is, or what a OSBP office is? Okay, so Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization, or Office of Small Business Programs, right? Every agency, except for the SBA, statutorily they don't have to have one, has to have this office. And that office is the advocate for you and is sort of the police to make sure that the agency meets its goal. So when you look at USA spending, you'll see that some, and I think the reports are still up there, you'll see that some agencies have a really low goal, like Department of Energy has like 10%, 11%, 12%, because they buy things that aren't necessarily small business friendly. Department of Defense is like 21%. If I remember correctly, I think HHS is somewhere in the 40s, DOI is in the 40s, SBA is like a 74%. You'll also see, as the scorecard came out, you'll see who's having a tough time meeting their goals. That's maybe where you want to sort of strategically, target. But every agency has a small business office. They're there to advocate for the small businesses, to cast a broader net and bring in new players, and to work with their acquisition folks to make sure requirements get set aside. So the way I look at approaching an agency is, do I know the contracting office? Do I know the program office? And have I been engaged with the small business office? And larger agencies like the Department of Defense, right? So the Department of Defense has, instead of Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization, OSDBU, they have OSBP, and a couple of other agencies have changed the name as well. DOD is so mammoth that they have OSBP for DOD, then each of the components have their own OSDBU office, and then there are small business specialists at the various buying activities. So if you do your research and you're like, okay, I got to go to Wright-Patterson and Aberdeen, you want to identify who the small business specialist is at those buying activities. There will be one. And then you want to start figuring out, are they going to have matchmaking days or industry days? I want to be there. You want to look at their pipeline and see, okay, what's coming up for rebid? Remember we looked at all the contracts? So if you look at all the contracts and you're seeing that they're expiring, even before they're listed on SAM, you can meet with the small business office and say, hey, I know this is coming up. We're really well qualified for this. And guess what? We're 8A and we can even get the sole source. The other low-hanging fruit is, how do I explain this? Let's say you identify Aberdeen. Let's say you identify a whole bunch of 8A contracts that were previously sole sourced. From that, you can identify 10 companies that are graduating from the 8A program that had those sole source contracts. Once you graduate from the 8A program, you can't get sole source contracts. So that's like the lowest hanging fruit, right? If you become an 8A, is where are their contracts like I can perform? Where are their sole sources, and where are those sole sources going to 8A companies that are about to graduate and therefore won't be eligible? Now, later on, and I don't know if we'll take a break or not, depends how tired you guys get from me. We can talk about a strategy with graduating 8As, mentoring new 8As, right? Because graduating 8As have contracts, and they want to be able to somehow participate in those contracts. So why not mentor a new 8A and figure out a partnership to allow them to continue some work on those contracts once they graduate? And that's sort of a strategy to partner up between a graduating 8A and a newer 8A. So, I'm sorry. I'll stop there. Is there any questions so far? Yes, ma'am. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So firms that are too large to participate in the 8A program, right? Because you have to be small. So the requirements are, number one, you have to be small, right? So if you've already either been through the 8A program and are no longer small, or you were never in the 8A program, but you're other than small, that doesn't mean that you're entirely out of the small business world. And there's a lot of large firms that look at mentor protege as well. So, and I can talk about this real quick and see if it generates any questions. Like I said, this is just a guide. This is a good discussion because the mentor protege program originally started in the 8A world. And it wasn't statutorily authorized. It was the SBA decided, hey, these newer 8As could really use help in getting into the marketplace, understanding how the marketplace works, establishing networks, building the systems like accounting systems, HR systems, project management systems. They could really use a mentor in helping them get there, right? And so they developed the 8A mentor protege program. And that meant the mentor would have a protege, and some benefits would flow from mentor to protege. And there's 5 areas, and we can put them up later, but basically what I mentioned, right? Do they need financial capacity? Do they need systems, HR, IT? Do they need business development, networking, all those things, right? One of them is international trade, and a lot of times that one, and it doesn't have to be all 5. It can be 2 or 1 or 3 of the 5, right? So what's the benefit to the mentor when they provide the assistance to the protege? Well, the SBA said, hey, guess what? You can do a joint venture together. The protege has to own 51% of this joint venture, right? And the protege has to be in the driver's seat. But the past performance of both members will flow to that joint venture. That means the 51% is the 8A company. The designation flows from the 8A company, so that JV is an 8A. But if your mentor is Lockheed or the medium-sized firm, all their past performance flows to the JV too. So now you have an 8A with your designation that has the past performance qualifications not only of your own firm, but of the mentor as well. So that becomes really competitive. And the benefit to the mentor, the other than small, is that instead of only being able to do 49% of the work, they can do up to 60% of the work. Okay? So under the joint venture, the mentor can do 60% of the work. Now, one step back, why do I say 49? When there's a set-aside contract, right, you go after a set-aside contract as an 8A or a women-owned or service disabled. The requirements of the program are that the prime contractor does the majority of the work, so at least 50 or 51%. You can subcontract 49% of it, but you're supposed to do 50%. Now, if you're in construction, it's called limitations on subcontracting. If you're in construction, it's less. It can be 15%. If you're in a specialty trade, it's like 25%. But generally speaking, the prime contractor has to do 50%, right? Now, rules changed, and it allows the prime contractor plus any similarly situated companies. So if your subcontractor is another 8A, and it was an 8A set aside, together you can do the 50%. However, the small businesses have to do that 50%, not the large. What the Mentor Protege program allows is if you do that joint venture, yes, the protege is in the driver's seat. Yes, they have to own 51% of the joint venture, but the mentor can do up to 60% of that work. So that's a way for the mentor to participate in the set-aside programs. And the other great sort of initiative that the Hill started and SBA implemented was expanding the Mentor Protege program, not just out of the 8A program, so not just 8A, but all the socio categories. So now women-owned, hubs-owned, service-disabled companies can get mentors as well, and then can do joint ventures and go after set-aside or sole source opportunities. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions so far? Yes, sir.
Just don't know the basics. Drafting on SAM is challenging, especially if you're domiciled on a reservation,
Yeah.
where you don't have, for example, street addresses. That's a big one. And
Yeah.
if you're registered with your tribe's corporation law system,
Yeah.
another challenge.
Yeah.
I went through it myself. I lived in Montana.
Did that finally work, by the way? Okay.
Finally works, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm curious about, other folks that are trying to do that and get stuck.
Yeah.
But then it begs the question for me, and I noticed that, for example, I think NEI just recently announced a big database where they try to identify all businesses,
Tribally owned.
tribal businesses, and so that's a pretty big universe. And so I guess the question is, how do we get more of our native businesses
Registered.
in SAMs and registered and get them hooked up, get them trained so that they can take
Yeah.
opportunity advantage of all these federal contracts?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So Derek talks about SAM and the challenges with SAM for native firms owned by Native Americans on reservation most of the times. And this, I mean, and this will go out to even in Guam, it's like they have no street addresses, right? That's another area that has a challenge. And I think Chris is going to talk about the Buy Indian Act and expanding that. But you're absolutely right. So when it comes to SAM, what I was talking about it being quirky is it doesn't recognize the realities of living on a reservation, right? And the fact that sometimes you don't have a street address. It doesn't often realize, if you're tribally owned, doesn't realize an entity organized under tribal corporate code. And those are instances where you'll have to reach out to the help desk, right? And we've done this, and I think, Chris, you've probably done this as well.
All the Native American tax accelerator programs.
Yeah.
That's why we exist as Native American tax accelerator.
It's a challenge. I mean, it takes outreach. There is no, and this is a shame because we've talked to the GSA folks around this, right, to accommodate the fact that on reservations, a lot of times you're not going to have a street address. And by the way, you may be recognized or organized under tribal code. And quite frankly, the ownership structure of a tribal entity, when they look at, well, wait a second, where's the state registration? It's like, there is no state registration. So you're going to have to, in those instances, go to the help desk and follow up with the help desk, but there are the Apex centers that can help with that. Yes, sir.
Well, I did that, and question number one is what's the impact? And so when you run into that problem, the help desk folks sometimes don't have the knowledge base. Especially if you're in New Mexico, they say, well, you're in the wrong country.
Yes. Yes.
I've had it before.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe we all need to work together to figure out how to approach, I don't know, GSA or.
It is. It is.
Hey, you know what? Don't forget any country.
And I think Jackson probably reaches, we should bug him this afternoon. But yeah, no, we've done this with the GSA as well. But I think there are advocates, and I guarantee you SBA has looked at this from their Office of Native American Affairs. But it's just so hard. I mean, the system, again, I'm not being critical, well, I am being a little bit critical of the government, but the GSA SAM system is so built in a very unflexible way with respect to the data that has to be entered. And so if there's any diversion from the way it expects data to be entered, all of a sudden it falls into like a no man's land. And it does take hand-holding, and a lot of times you're right, you'll reach out to the help desk and they'll be like, no, you can't do that. And it's like, no, we can, but you have to elevate. Yes, ma'am. For the SAM registration? Okay, so that's a good point. You work with the Navajo Nation government itself to do the geocoordinates, and you use that for the SAM profile. Okay, perfect, perfect. Yeah, it's got to be a workaround, right? Yeah. Any other questions so far? Anything online? No? Okay, so overall requirement on a set aside, right? It's you have to be small, right? So small, though, in the federal government place can be a little bit confusing because it goes by North American Industry Classification Code. So you could be small in manufacturing, you could be small by the number of employees. And I used to get this question all the time, is how is a firm with 1,500 employees considered small? I'd say, well, that's ship manufacturing, right? So in that industry, 1,500 is actually small. And in professional services or revenue-based, IT services is at 35 million. Professional services used to be at 17, I think it went up to 21. But you have to be small. If you're applying to the 8A program, you have to be small in your primary NAICS code, okay? For the other programs, you have to be small in one of your NAICS codes. So when you go into SAM and you register, you have primary NAICS code. You can have a whole bunch of secondary NAICS codes. You have to be small in at least one of the other NAICS codes. The other thing that I'd say is when the requirement comes out, so let's say, okay, I got into SAM, I got into the 8A program. When a requirement comes out, a proposal comes out, and a request for proposal comes out, that requirement always has a NAICS code attached to it. You have to be small to bid on that particular requirement. So there are instances where you can be small for one NAICS code and other than small in another NAICS code, right? So you could potentially be able to bid on some things as you grow and be prohibited from bidding on others. Every requirement has a NAICS code. The requirement when you bid as a small business is you're representing that you're small for that requirement. Where this comes, now, you do that when you bid, right? Where this comes up in a question is if you bid and someone protests, then the SBA will get, Small Business Administration will get involved to say, wait a second, are you really small? And they'll ask a whole bunch of questions with respect to your revenues. We'll talk about affiliation, relationships, to determine if you are indeed small for that particular NAICS code and that requirement. The other thing that is basic with respect to the set-aside programs is that the firm is small, but then you as an individual own and control at least 50% of the company, right? If it's women-owned, service-disabled, or 8A. Okay, what does that mean? Own and control. So own is easy. I own 51%. Control is where it becomes difficult, right? A lot of times you might have a minority owner. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But if the minority owner and the operating agreement require unanimous consent to make day-to-day decisions, SBA is going to say that there's negative control. So you own, but you don't really control. If the minority owner doesn't have unanimous consent provisions, but if the minority owner, gave you a $2 million injection to your company and you didn't put anything, SBA is going to consider that potentially negative control because they're going to say, yeah, on paper, you own and it says you control, but why would, that person just gave you $2 million. Clearly, you're going to have to follow their direction. So there are ways that ownership and control can be affected with respect to the business arrangements and the operating agreement or the corporate documents. I'll give you another example. So we talked about unanimous consent provisions, right? If the operating agreement or the corporate bylaws say, everybody has to vote on if we're going to go get a contract with the federal government, or if we're going to go get a loan, or for day-to-day operations. SBA is going to say, well, that's a unanimous consent provision. You don't really have control. If there's a provision in there, and this just came up with one of our clients, you can't call a quorum unless the majority of the folks, or no, 70 supermajority of the folks are present. Then that means one individual or your minority partner can put a quash on you calling a quorum, so that's negative control. You can't get the job of the business done. So there are arrangements like that that you need to be aware of, and that will come up when you go to 8A certification that you might need to address. That's sort of the good scenario, right? You go to 8A certification, they're looking at your documents, and they're like, oh, you need to change this provision, right? That's sort of ahead of the time. You fix it, you get into the program. The challenge is that in instances where you're just small, right? You haven't had those reviewed. So if you get protested, you could be found to be other than small, and you don't even know it. So if you're other than small, if you're small, but you're other than 8A or something that's been front-end certified, I'd encourage you to sort of just be aware of those types of relationships that can prove to be challenging in cases of a protest. The other thing that you should be aware of is, where is this one? Affiliation. So, how many folks know what affiliation is when it comes to government contracting? Okay. So, this used to always challenge me because, I did federal contracting before I went to the SBA. And I used to tell the story, and my staff was always like, you know what, you probably shouldn't tell that story. That doesn't look really, really good. We were small. We used to partner with larger firms all the time. Like one of them was Deloitte. And we'd pursue small business set-aside contracts, right? And I would say, yeah, well, you know what? Deloitte's our partner. They can write the proposal. They can do all the, the project management. They can find the right resources. We're fine. Yeah, we'll do 50% of the work, limitations on subcontracting, remember that, but they can do everything else. Well, if you're unduly reliant on a subcontractor, which is other than small, even if they're small, that's ostensible subcontracting. So what's SBA going to do in case you get protested? They're going to say you're affiliated. And affiliation in and of itself is not a bad thing, but they'll combine your revenues because you're affiliated. And now if they combine your revenues with Deloitte, you're going to be other than small. So you're not going to prevail in case of a protest, right? So there's a relation. If you do a whole bunch of joint ventures, now, if you had a mentor-protege relationship with Deloitte, all that is exempted, right? Because in a mentor-protege relationship, they're supposed to provide assistance. And all the assistance that comes from mentor to protege is exempted from affiliation. So it's a good way of protecting against affiliation. But if you did a whole bunch of joint ventures with other small companies, you can never do a joint venture with a big company unless you have a mentor protege, because you're going to be found affiliated. But if you did small to small joint ventures, but you did them over and over and over again, you're going to be found affiliated over time. If you have common management or common facilities, or do a whole bunch of prime sub relationships and then joint ventures, the challenge is that the SBA doesn't have like a bright, yellow line of saying, this is affiliated, this is not. And I used to hate this because this was one of the offices, the size adjudication. What they say is they'll look at the totality of the circumstances. And depending on which size specialist desk it falls on, those totality of circumstances may be evaluated differently, right? Now, you can always appeal to OHA, Office of Hearing and Appeals, but they'll look at totality of circumstances. So the one thing we always tell clients is, we know business can be ugly, right? Because there's all sorts of tentacles. You might have a brother that does something and you subcontracted with them. You might have a partner that at one point had another firm that might have been an 8A. You might do a whole bunch of joint ventures. These are things that happen in the private sector all the time. But try to keep it as clean as possible, so in case of a protest, you have clear lines of fracture. We had a client where it was a husband and wife, and they were sharing 1 or 2 employees. And SBA found that to be affiliation. Now, they were in the same building also, but they clearly had different leases. But it's totality of circumstances, right, that you just need to be cautious of. Any questions? Oh, the other one is, I'll give you another example. How much time do we have? Ooh, we already have an hour gone. I hope you guys aren't bored. You're not asking a lot of questions. I'll give you another example. This was a period of time at the SBA where we were encouraging, just like they are today, encouraging firms to apply to the 8A program, right? There was a service-disabled firm that we thought could qualify as an 8A company. Convinced them, hey, 2 designations looks better than 1. 8A, sole source, you already have federal work. This is a great approach. They came into the 8A program. They applied. They were receiving over 70% of their revenues from one source, one prime contractor. That's another potential finding of affiliation. The 8A analyst identified that, said, we got to send this file for a size determination. Went to the size office. The size office said, oh, you're other than small. So then SBA said, thank you for coming in. We're not going to get you 8A certified. You're no longer an SDVOSB, and you can no longer certify yourself as a small business. So we thought that we were doing them a favor. They ended up getting kicked out entirely. Now, this is a horror story, right? But I'm just telling you this because I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just saying that some of the relationships that we may have in business may be found to be a finding of affiliation, and you should just be aware of common ownership, sources of revenue, common management, joint ventures, those types of things. And again, affiliation in and of itself isn't bad. It's just that your revenues may be combined to determine if you are actually small or not. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
For 8A certification, is there a requirement that you have to have more than 1 contract for your income? Somebody told me like there's an 80-20 rule, you have to have at least 2 contracts.
Well, so that's a great question. The 8A, it's a little subjective because the SBA looks for potential for success for 8A companies. And the rule of thumb is, are you in business for more than 2 years? And do you have a plurality of sources of income? So yeah, if you only have one source of income, the risk is that they may identify you to be affiliated with that source of income. Now, the rules have sort of loosened up since that tragedy, where if it's a newly established entity, in other words, first 2, 3, 4 years, there's leniency on the fact that you might only have one source of income, right? But you want to be cautious of that. And there's an exemption for 2 years in business, right? The rule of thumb is you have to be in 2 years in business before you apply to the 8A program. The exception is if you can write a justification a justification that can demonstrate that you have some contracts, you are an industry expert, you have networks, you just left, I don't know, a large firm and you've been in industry, you can make a case to waive that 2-year requirement. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Yeah. No, so that's a great question. So the question was the business with respect to being small versus the individual who certifies for the 8A program. So one of the requirements is that the business itself be small. And in the 8A program, you have to be small for your primary NAICS code. And the way SBA determines your primary NAICS code is they'll look at contracts. Like if you don't have federal contracts, they'll say, okay, send us your statements of work for the work you have. We'll determine what your primary NAICS code is. So you do have to be small. Now, if your revenues are, let's say your revenues are 23 million, you're no longer small for professional services, but you're still small for IT services because that's 35 million. But you have to demonstrate to the SBA, if all your contracts are in professional services, you can't randomly just pick IT services or shipbuilding and say, I'm still small. They'll look at your contracts, okay? Now, the other question is with respect to the individual for the 8A program. So I'm glad you brought that up because I haven't gotten to that yet, but we'll jump into that now. When you go to apply for the 8A program, right, we talked about ownership and control. And we talked about that the entity has to be small. For the 8A program, there's two other requirements. Either you're a tribal entity and the tribe gets evaluated to determine that it is economically disadvantaged, and that happens only once, and then thereafter you can just pop in 8A number 2, 8A number 3, et cetera. Or you're an individual. For an individual, you have to demonstrate that you're socially disadvantaged. And the easy, I guess, button for socially disadvantaged are the presumed classes. So African American, Native American, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander, there are the presumed classes. However, you can also be found socially disadvantaged through the preponderance of evidence. So when I was running the program, we would see Caucasian women in the 8A program. Why? Because in construction women oftentimes, women in the construction industry are oftentimes disadvantaged and discriminated against, right? Or IT services. And preponderance doesn't mean that you can just say, I was discriminated against. You have to connect the dots. And this is, we used to get a lot of these applications, and the applicant would get mad because they'd say, look, I was discriminated. But you have to connect the dots. You have to say, I was discriminated, and that ended up in not getting a job, or not getting education, or not being able to get financing, or not being able to get a contract. So you have to be able to connect those dots. So the two requirements are socially disadvantaged and economic disadvantaged. Economic disadvantaged in the 8A program, there are requirements with respect to net assets, and there's a slide on this, but these will be available. Let's see. I want to put it up so you guys, there it is. So it's net assets, AGI, adjusted gross income, and total assets, right? So for net assets, you can take out the value of your retirement, the value of your principal residence, and the value of your company. And if that's below $750,000, that's net assets, you're good. AGI has to be less than $350,000 for the previous 3 years. And then for total assets, you put everything back in, but you can keep out retirement. And that's got to be less than $6 million. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? Yes, ma'am.
So how does that work with, so how do you show this? Like, I'm married and we've always filed jointly.
Yeah.
So is there an evaluation of, my husband is not affiliated with my
Yeah.
business?
That becomes a challenge, yes.
How does that work?
So if you've always filed jointly, you can make the case to the SBA to separate out your assets from your husband's. Now, if they're jointly owned, that becomes more challenging, right? Because if the assets are jointly owned, that becomes more challenging. If you have a whole bunch of properties that are jointly owned, that becomes more challenging. Or if your investment accounts are jointly owned, that becomes more challenging. But with the SBA, if you can demonstrate that your husband's assets are not available for your business and to you to run your business, then you can create a and you have to submit a personal financial statement. And SBA will look at your tax returns. You have to submit your tax returns and your personal financial statements. And we've worked with clients to separate out husband and wife, but it is subjective, and you have to demonstrate that those assets are not going to be available. They're not held jointly. They're not going to be available to you to run your business. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Okay. Now, as I mentioned, economically disadvantaged and socially disadvantaged for the 8A program. For tribes, the first time you apply, you have to demonstrate that the tribe and its population are economically disadvantaged. There are certain criteria that the SBA asks to outline. Like generally when we work with a tribe, you do a tribal timeline, history, you talk about access to capital, and not just today, right? Because some tribes have been successful over the last several decades, but how about historically? What was their access to capital historically? What's their access to education and health and transportation on reservation or with descendants or with members of the tribe? So it's really painting a picture with respect to and some tribes, you know, have well-developed either internal census data that they keep and economic data, or sometimes they fall under the U.S. Census where the tribe is analyzed as a separate entity. And then we've even worked with some state-level tribes where we've done surveys of the tribal population and presented that to the SBA as economic data for justification of the tribe's participation in the 8A program. So it's sometimes the data and collection of the data can be challenging, but SBA is flexible if it's done in a, you know, as clean as and quote unquote scientific way as possible, and you have a good representation of the tribal population to tell the story of the economic disadvantage status of the tribe. And then you do that the first time, and then every additional 8A is just an 8A application. You don't have to Now, the SBA has always said, at some point we may come back and ask for updated data. However, from my history before going to the SBA, running the programs, and since then, I've never seen the SBA come back and say, oh, we want updated data. Once you're in the program. You can add additional 8As. And again, I always get this question, well, why? And the reason is because those programs support entire communities. That's why. They have special privileges. And that's the intent of the program. Any questions so far? No. Okay, so we talked about 8A requirements. We talked about hub zone requirements earlier. On the women-owned program, it used to be self-representation. Now it's full front-end certification, right? And in that and the service disabled, which also recently came to the SBA, it's full front-end certification. So you still have the requirements around ownership, control, and small, right? Women-owned, it's easy. You have to demonstrate that you're women-owned and the individual that owns the company controls. Now, there are only certain NAICS codes. The reason the Women-Owned Small Business Program is unique is there are only certain NAICS codes where the federal government can set aside contracts for women-owned small businesses. These are NAICS codes that were identified as where women-owned firms are significantly underutilized, right? And in addition to just the basic WOSB program, there is, I used to call them WOSB and EdWOSB. And under the EdWOSB program, which is economically disadvantaged women-owned small business program, there are additional NAICS codes where requirements can be set aside. If you can qualify for EdWOSB, you automatically qualify for WOSB, but it's not vice versa, right? And the economic disadvantaged qualifications are similar to the 8A, right? In other words, net assets, AGI, total assets. Does that all make sense? Service disabled, similar. Ownership, control, small, and then can you demonstrate that you're a service disabled member, service member? Okay. Before I because I think this is important, I wanted to talk about this because you guys are and then we talked about size standards, so I'm not going to go over that again, but you guys are sort of you're the army that is in the field working on getting requirements set aside. And I always say this, when I was in the small business programs across the SBA and across the federal agency are so outnumbered, like the number of staff that they have. I mean, sometimes it's frustrating for us on the outside because we'll try to engage with a small business office or your business opportunity specialist or the OSDBU, and we get frustrated because we don't get a return call or a return email, but they are so understaffed that a lot of times it's the small businesses that are the army that's enforcing set-asides. So how many people know what the rule of two is? Okay, I kind of mentioned it earlier. If there are two or more small businesses that can provide the service or product at a reasonable price, not best price, reasonable price, then that requirement has to be set aside. It's a shall. It's not a may, right? It shall be set aside. And that's regulatory and statutory. Although statutory is, you could argue that over the simplified acquisition threshold it doesn't exist, but I argue otherwise. But the rule of two basically is if there are two or more small businesses that can do it, the contracting officer has to set it aside. So this is why it's important, when the contracting officer goes to do the market research, one of the first places they go is dynamic small business search. So if you're not updating your quals in dynamic small business search, they're like, oh, I did my market research, no small businesses, I'm not going to set this aside. Okay? That's one way they do it. You've probably heard this, and Chris is going to talk about sources sought and responding and making sure you respond appropriately. I think you're going to talk about all that, right? So you got to do that as well. Who monitors the rule of two, right? So the SBA has, how many folks know what a procurement center representative is? PCR. Okay. So I used to be responsible for that office as well. When I started the program, we were somewhere in the range of 200 PCRs around the country. And if you can imagine, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of buying activities. And the PCR is the police that is at the buying activity enforcing the rule of two. Any requirement that is not set aside is supposed to be signed off on a Form 2579. Can't believe I remembered it. Form 2579 by the PCR, right? If it's not set aside. When I left government, we were down to 119 PCRs, and I thought that was horrible. We kept advocating for more. The last I heard, the SBA is down to like 40 PCRs, right? And I used to always argue this. The SBA entire year's budget is spent in one day at the Department of Defense. In one day. So they're understaffed, right? So who can help the PCR? It's you and I, right? So if we're responding to sources sought and those requirements aren't getting set aside, I'm going to email the PCR. Right? I'm going to be like, hey, this was a requirement. I know we responded. I know a bunch of our colleagues responded, and this should have been set aside. What's going on at this buying activity? And the SBA has a really good, I'll say this, they have a really good directory of PCRs. If you go to the SBA website and search PCR, it'll show which PCR covers every buying activity. And then it'll show who the area director is. So that the PCRs are broken into 10 areas. And also show who the boss is. So you can engage with the PCR, and they like to hear like, oh, wait a second, this particular activity isn't doing a good job. We've worked with clients even during acquisition planning, right? So the other thing you can do, when you're doing your market research, the other thing you can do is during acquisition planning, you can have a discussion with the small business specialist and the PCR, especially if it's a requirement that traditionally hadn't been set aside, but you're like, hey, wait a second, there are small businesses that can do this. This should be set aside. With the memo that came out from the White House that increased the goal from 5 to 15%, the other part of the memo was that small business specialists and PCRs should have a seat at the table during acquisition planning. So this means when the contracting officer is working with the program office and determining, hey, how are we going to go ahead and procure this IT system? The PCR and the small business specialist are supposed to be at the table. Does that always happen? Probably not, because they're understaffed. But can we help them if we're seeing requirements not get set aside? Yes. Can we step in? And a lot of times when you want to step in during the acquisition planning period, the contracting officer will say, no. That's, procurement integrity. That's not true. Until the proposal is released, they can have discussion with industry with respect to acquisition strategy. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to offer for the audience that, from a travel perspective, bring two to the table. So if I know Navajo, state in front of me, has a small business in that same anecdote, I'm responding to both of us saying, I found two.
Yeah.
I don't wait for the government because he just said they only have 40 people. So I make sure that I get that set aside. So if you know a small business and you have a good
Yeah.
relationship with them, bring it to them. It's not a lazy factor, it's absolutely
Yeah.
they're understaffed, and sometimes they miss us.
Yeah.
We're small. Some
Yeah.
of us are micro businesses and we just get overlooked. So
Yeah.
I make it easy. I want that contract. So
Yeah, working,
offer that up, and it's a good way to partner with.
absolutely.
especially tribes.
Working with your colleagues and making sure that there's a good response to a RFI, request for information, or a sources sought. And even if you get involved before that, if it's not an RFI and you just see something in the procurement pipeline, you can engage with the acquisition planning process with the small business office or the PCR to get it set aside. Any questions? Okay, so that's the rule of two, right? The other place where small businesses or small business set-asides occur are under the simplified acquisition threshold, or SAT, right? So the simplified acquisition threshold is $250,000. Everything under $250,000 is automatically reserved. In other words, should go 100% to small business. Now, there's a reason why that doesn't happen, right? So let's say a Cisco license or a Microsoft license. Those have to go to Cisco or Microsoft. A lot of times there's no resellers. So agencies, however, should be like in the 90s, right? But if you look at, and USA Spend used to publish this, I think they still do. If you look at SAT performance, you can see some agencies perform really poorly. Those are the places, I guarantee you, their small business specialists are trying to figure out how to get those numbers up. Those are good targets for marketing as well. So engaging with agencies that are performing poorly on SAT is important also. And I know it's 250 and you're like, well, I mean, 250, is that worth the effort? The one thing that, there's two reasons why. One is simplified acquisition threshold. I love this. SAT follows SAP, S-A-P. Simplified acquisition threshold follows simplified acquisition procedures, right? So if you're new to federal contracting and you're like, all these federal acquisition requirements, and by the way, small businesses are exempted from a good number of them around cost accounting standards and other standards. However, if you're going to play in the federal marketplace, you do have to comply with federal acquisition regulation. But if it's under the simplified acquisition threshold, they follow the simplified acquisition procedures. So in addition to subcontracting being a good entree into the federal marketplace, the simplified acquisition threshold is also a good place. And all requirements over $25,000 have to be listed in SAM, so you'll find these requirements in SAM, and you can try to track them in USA Spend to identify when they might be coming up for rebid. When I was at the SBA, we worked with OMB to try to increase the simplified acquisition threshold to $500,000. We almost got it done, and I always say this, for whatever reason, the Office of the Trade Representative got a complaint from Canada. Don't know why to this date, but the Canadian government had an objection to it, so it didn't get increased. There is discussion, and I used to not be able to say this, right? And I hope the National Center supports this as well. There has been discussion to increase the simplified acquisition threshold to $1 million, right? So in my opinion, in my humble opinion, if everything under $1 million was exclusively reserved for small business, that would definitely encourage more participation, newer participants in federal contracting, and it would help achieve the federal government's goal of getting to higher performance and bringing in new small businesses. If you look at the number of individual small businesses in federal government, this is something that the federal government is struggling with. Remember earlier we talked about category management and government-wide acquisition contracts where, there used to be thousands and thousands of widget makers and now there's a handful because we had category management. Well, over the last decade, the federal government has lost, I think there's a slide on there. I'm not going to go all the way ahead, but the slides are available. They've lost something like 60% of the small businesses participating in the federal marketplace, and new entrants are down 40%. Now, category management was one of the reasons, right? There's other hurdles, right? There's CMMC, which, Chris, are you going to talk about CMMC? Okay, I always forget what that acronym stands for. Cybersecurity Maturity Model something, certification. And so DOD has been working to implement that over the they keep threatening they're going to launch it, they're going to require it, they keep moving it back because small businesses aren't necessarily prepared. They now have a website. I'd encourage you to look at the DOD Office of Small Business Programs. They have a CMMC landing page, and they have resources available for small businesses because here's the challenge. The DOD said, and I think it was supposed to be last year, you have to be CMMC certified. But nobody really established what does it mean to be CMMC certified? What are the requirements? And so there was all sorts of, I don't want to say like charlatans because they didn't know either, but there were firms out there saying, oh yeah, we'll review your systems and we'll certify that you have cybersecurity, the model in place. And they were charging anywhere from like $5,000 to $25,000, but there were no clear standards. And then DOD worked with NIST and came up with some standards. And then it was really difficult to force small businesses to follow those standards. And some businesses were spending $25,000, $30,000, $35,000. So they've pushed it back a few times, and now they have more and more resources available. What I can say is that usually what happens at the DOD will happen at the civilian agencies. And this is one of those things that is a major issue with respect to cybersecurity and access to federal data and federal systems, et cetera. And as a contractor, you begin to be sort of intertwined with all that, and small businesses are a weak point of entering that. So it is an initiative. You should make yourself aware of it, and you'll talk a little bit more about it, but that's another barrier to entry. But having said that, we keep seeing fewer and fewer small businesses participate in federal government, yet because of the White House initiatives, the federal government is looking to cast a broader and broader net, hit higher goals, bring in new participants. Raising the simplified acquisition threshold is an easy way of doing that, and then obviously getting firms to be qualified to get into the 8A, HubZone, women-owned, service-disabled programs, and then encouraging them to bid and participate is another way of doing it. Any questions so far? Yes, ma'am. That's a great question. So the question was, newly certified firms, what percentage actually bid on contracts? So I don't know that I have the data on that. But what I will say is when I was responsible for the 8A program, we had roughly 6,500, between 6,500 and 7,000 firms in the 8A program. Of those, about a third got one-off contracts. of the 1/3 that got one-off contracts, there was like 250 that got the lion's share of the contract dollars. So it is competitive, and this is why, there's always a debate. Do we just need to cast a broader net and bring more 8A companies in, or do we really need to help the 8A companies to become more competitive and win? Because we do have 7,000 firms, but only 1/3 of them are winning one-off contracts. So that's a great question. I wish I had the answer, but I don't know once you get certified, how often are they actually bidding? Any other questions so far? Okay, so I do want to talk about, because we mentioned this, right? We talked about the Hub Zone program. We're going to go through SDVOSB, women-owned. Okay, so here, because this is really an important program that I think, we touched on it. You had the question in the back. But if you are a new entrant into the federal marketplace, I think, especially in the environment where contracts are getting larger and more complex, right? You're looking at the government-wide acquisition vehicles. You're looking at the category management vehicles. I think it's really important to at least consider having a mentor. But what I would say is that it's like a marriage, right? So you have to be really, really selective. A lot of firms that we counsel, they'll be like, oh, you know what, I want Lockheed Martin, or I want Boeing. Well, yeah, a lot of people want them, right? But are they ideal? Because in my opinion, to the point that you made with respect to minority firms that are sort of not large but medium size, other than small, those firms have grown maybe from the 8A size to other than small. They are closer to the challenges that you face as a business and can probably provide more insight with respect to growing, managing a payroll, the challenges that you face as a small business. The larger firms may be able to bring opportunities, but they're going to assign you a small business liaison officer. And not that they're bad, right? But sometimes they don't understand or are able to provide the particular types of assistance that you need. Now, as a protege, the reason I say be very selective, as a protege, you only get 2 mentors in your entire life as a small business, right? There used to be no way of annulling that marriage. SBA came out with new regulations that said, you know what, if before 18 months you haven't consummated the marriage with a joint venture and some work, you can come in and you're not receiving assistance from your mentor, come in and we'll annul that mentor-protege relationship, right? So it's a little bit less stringent, but I would still argue that if you only get 2 mentors in your entire life, you're very selective. And then on the other side, the mentor can have 1 but up to 3 proteges at any given point, right? So they can cycle in and out. And the mentor-protege program is a 3+3 program. So 3 years initial term, everything's going well, it gets extended for another 3-year term. And then these are the types of assistance, wrong one. These are the types of assistance that are supposed to flow from mentor to protege, right? And why would anybody, any mentor want to participate? What we were talking about earlier, right? So if you have, let's say, I always use Lockheed, I don't know why I pick on them, but let's say Lockheed, right? From yesterday to before, they couldn't compete in the 8A world. They can't go after sole source, they can't go after unlimited sole source. They're left out of the small business world. Now, if they mentor, let me just give an example of a tribal 8A. If they mentor a tribal 8A gets started, they want to do something in that industry, they start this mentor-protege relationship, benefits have to flow from mentor to protege, right? Under the mentor-protege agreement. And now you can create a joint venture. As we talked about earlier, that joint venture has to be 51% owned by the tribe, And similar to when you go apply for the 8A program, that joint venture has to demonstrate that the tribe, in this case the protege, not only owns but controls. So similar, there can't be unanimous consent provisions, there can't be negative control. Really, you have to demonstrate that the tribe owns and controls. We worked not long ago with a tribal entity that was creating a mentor-protege relationship with a $4 billion IT services company. Now, the $4 billion IT services company was really reluctant just to hand over the keys and say, okay, protege, you own and control. But if you look at the SBA regulatory requirements, they're very clear. There's a few exceptions that are extraordinary exceptions, like, filing a lawsuit, bringing on a new member, dissolving the company. Those are extraordinary circumstances. But this large firm was reluctant to just hand over the key. So we worked with them and their attorneys, and none of us are attorneys on our side, but most of us participate in running these programs. We worked with them to craft the language to give some comfort level to the mentor that, yes, the protege has the keys, but there are some checks and balances. But we made sure that they went eyes open, right? And why do I say that? Because your joint venture, when they win, so now that joint venture, why is it important? That joint venture now has the quals of Lockheed, but it's a tribal 8A. So now this joint venture can go after an unlimited sole source at the Department of Defense with the quals of Lockheed, right? Now, if you get protested, and you can't get protested on a sole source, but let's say it was a competitive one, SBA is going to ask for that joint venture agreement. And this is where you have to go eyes open, right? If you're skirting that line around control, the analyst, the size analyst, may say, no, there's too much undue influence by that mentor. So sometimes, when we look at this, we always tell the protege, or if we're advising the mentor, keep it as clean as possible. No unanimous control, no borderline control by the mentor. Let's just keep it as clean as possible because it is subject to protest. It used to be SBA used to approve these on the front end. SBA doesn't do that anymore, especially if it's not sole source. If it's competitive, you bid on it, you're supposed to have it all in place. You get a SAM registration for your joint venture, you bid on it, you get protested, that's when SBA is going to ask for the documentation. And if you're borderline, depending on whose desk it falls on, they might say, mentor has undue influence, right? So you just want to be careful of that. Sometimes the mentor is going to be reluctant to finalize a joint venture agreement that doesn't allow them some limited control, but just be aware that you may lose on a protest. So that's, I guess, number one. Number two, with respect to approvals, 15 minutes? Oh, I thought you were giving me the heads up. With respect to approvals, it used to be the SBA would require the whole package to go in, competitive or non-competitive, on 8A. They first came out and said, okay, you know what, on sole source opportunities, we want the package. On everything else, don't worry about it. They've now even streamlined that a little bit more where they, on sole source opportunities, they request for a checklist, but they're not going to review in depth that joint venture agreement. But you're challenged with the fact that you may get protested and you want to make sure that it's created in a way that will pass muster in case of a protest. Again, you can always appeal to the Office of Hearing and Appeals, but that's a challenge. Any questions on the mentor-protege relationship so far? So we understand the 3+3, and everything that happens here is exempted from affiliation. So if you're going to be partnering with someone, you're going to do a lot of this stuff, you probably want a mentor-protege relationship in place. But you're limited to 2, so you want to make sure it's the right team. Right? Okay, so now you have the MPA. You create JV number 1. You guys know what the time limit is on JV? Okay. The joint venture used to be a convoluted rule, and for the longest time, it was under my program, and I would always get confused with the 3-2 rule. 3 contracts, 2 years, or 2 contracts, 3, I always used 3 contracts, 2 years, whatever it was. It was confusing. They streamlined it. It's just 2 years. From the date that joint venture gets its first contract, and a contract they mean a prime award, you have 2 years life on that joint venture. That doesn't mean you can't accept bids that were out, right? So if your 2-year clock closes, you had a whole bunch of bids out, you can accept those bids, but you can't bid anymore. Now, under the MPA, because you have the MPA and it's a 3+3, you can create joint venture number 2. And then you can create joint venture number 3 and 4, et cetera, right? And because it's under an MPA, you remember when we talked about earlier about the risk of affiliation in too many joint ventures? Because you can do a small-to-small joint venture without an MPA. And all the benefits of past performance, all those things flow to the joint venture. But if you do too many of those, you can eventually be found to be affiliated. With an MPA, you're never found to be affiliated. You can do JV number 2, 3, 4, et cetera. Now, the SBA has always held that, hey, at some point, 1 too many JVs is just too many. But as long as I ran those programs, and as long as I've been out and working in this industry, SBA has never said that there's too many JVs under a mentor-protege agreement and that leads to a finding of affiliation. So as long as you have that MPA in place, you can do multiple JVs once your 2-year clock is up on the first one. Does that all make sense? Any questions? Yes?
You have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
How can a small business find other businesses that would be a good fit for joint venture?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that always comes up, right? So the question is, how do small businesses find good teaming partners, either for joint ventures or for mentor-protege, et cetera? That's always a challenge because the SBA doesn't do that. Like, they don't have a matchmaking process, right? And it is like a marriage. I mean, a lot of times you have to start out small. Like, do we do, a small-to-small joint venture? Do we do a prime-sub relationship? The other way to identify potential teaming partners is what we talked about earlier, industry days and matchmaking, right? So Res, I'll plug Res real quick. So Res has matchmaking, right? And there's a lot of networking going on at Res. Did you plant that question, by the way? No, but it is matchmaking at events, and it is networking at events. A lot of times, so Res has matchmaking. They have matchmaking with government entities. They have matchmaking with large prime contractors. You will be able to network with other 8As and other tribal 8As, et cetera. But even what we talked about earlier, once you identify your top 5 or 10 buying activities that you want to target, you got to research to see when they're having industry days. Because when they have industry days, they usually require their large primes to be present because they want their large primes to identify small business government contractors to be in their supply chain so those large primes can help hit their socio-category goals. So it's identifying those types of opportunities for matchmaking. Unfortunately, the SBA doesn't have sort of a matchmaking teaming arrangement program. The other thing that I'll say is the SBA does have an annual mentor-protege conference. I think this last one was in March or April, so next March or April that'll come up. And then dynamic small business search. What I mentioned earlier, the government uses DSBS for partnerships. You could go into dynamic small business search and look at the local jurisdiction and say, oh, around me, how many firms are in my industry that are hub zone or 8A or service disabled or woman-owned? Does it make sense to partner with those guys? Because one of the things that we've seen, and SBA encourages this, but again, you want to be cautious of doing it too many times, we've seen flip-flopping, if that's the right terminology, joint ventures. So in one instance, the 8A is the majority owner, 51%. So the 8A, the joint venture, gets that designation 8A, and then they'll turn around and do another joint venture where their hub zone company is the majority owner, the 51%, right? So you have a hub zone company and an 8A company, you do 2 JVs. And so now you have a JV that can go after 8A contracts, and you have a JV that can go after hub zone contracts, and that joint venture inherits past performance of both members. So that's another way of looking at it. But dynamic small business search is an interesting tool. When you go into it, go in, with a grain of salt, because it's like Internet 1.0. But the data in there is very useful, so be patient. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah, so the question was, does the joint venture inherit the status of one of the partners? And the answer is yes, the partner that owns and controls, right? So in my example, if it's a hub zone company and an 8A company, the first joint venture you would set up is where the 8A company owns 51%, and that company also controls. So if the 8A owns and controls, then that joint venture becomes 8A. But then you take the second joint venture, and now you have the hub zone company owns 51%, and you write the operating agreement in a way that the hub zone company owns the 51% and controls, and now it inherits the size and designation of the hub zone company. So it inherits, I guess the short answer is, the joint venture inherits the size and designation of its managing venture or managing member. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Yes?
Just to piggyback on the question, so you mentioned that depending on what, I guess the certification, the majority certification is where it stands. In terms of oftentimes they ask for a past performance, can you still add that information, say you broke away from that joint venture?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one step back. The joint venture will inherit the past performance of both members, right? And there's been some challenges to that, because you'll look at some recent procurements like OASIS and CIOSP4, and I know I'm throwing acronyms out there, but these are government-wide contracts from the GSA, where the GSA has limited the number of past performance references from the mentor, where they've said, whoa, at least 2 of them have to come from the protege. And then the SBA has said, well, wait a second, the whole program and process was that it inherits both. Why else would you don't want to do a joint venture? So that's been debated, and that's actually gone to Court of Federal Claims. And it sort of has settled in, there's got to be at least some representation from the protege, but majority can come from mentor. So that's on the one front. On the other front, the question is, okay, now I participated in this joint venture. Now tomorrow I want to go out and bid on my own. The SBA's position is that the managing member should be able to use those joint venture past preferences in bidding. Sometimes that's challenged, though. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then the other thing that I'd add, which is also a new regulation, which has been challenging in implementing, is that the SBA's regulations, I guess it was last year, required prime contractors to write past performance references for their subcontractors. So this is also another chicken and egg thing, right? You're always a subcontractor. You want to go bid on a prime contract. First question is, you have past performance references. It's like, I've never been a prime contractor. So there's a new regulation that says prime contractors have to write past performance references for their subcontractors. Implementation of that has been challenging because SBA really didn't clarify how that would work. if there would be a system to house those, like the CPAR system. Like when a contracting officer writes your past performance reference, it goes into a system that the federal other contracting officers have access to. So the question is, well, is there a system? Where is that a past performance reference going to go to? How long does a prime contractor have to write the past performance? What if you don't like the past performance? Can you appeal it? All these things happen at the prime contract level. It wasn't really clear how this would be implemented at the subcontract level. But technically, prime contractors are required to write a past performance reference. Now, I would argue that why would you even ask for a past performance reference if you knew they weren't going to give you a good one? So we probably don't need to deal with, like, are we going to appeal it? But there's also those questions out there. Does that make sense? Any other questions? No? Okay, I did want to show you just this. So federal contract, this is outdated a little bit, but federal contract, this has gone up even more, right? I'm not going to talk about this, but it's in the slides. What happened to, I just wanted to show you the loss of number, here we go. So when we talk about category management, 138,000 contracts disappeared, one-off contracts disappeared just between 2016 and 19 where category management was implemented, right? And that has continued. And then when you talk about federal supplier base, right? When you look at 2011 to 2020, the number of small businesses participating has continued to fall. And then when you can look at new entrants, that's continued to fall. So the federal government, because of these numbers, right, and because of the increase in goals, the federal government is keen on trying to get new participants into the federal marketplace. This is why this is important, right? Getting educated on how to get in, getting the right support services to get in, making sure that for tribally owned organizations that were participating in the federal marketplace, I'm almost done. Those are all important because this is a prime time to participate in federal contracting, and it can be daunting, but if you take it step by step and use the right resources that are out there, oftentimes for free, you can gain traction. And once you gain traction, the sky's the limit. So I will stop there, Yvette. Thank you guys. Thank you for your patience. I appreciate it.